All right, so welcome everybody to the Grant and Grantwriting for Collections Care Projects presentation today. My name is Eileen Corcoran. I am the Community Outreach Manager at the Vermont Historical Society, and we are excited to be co-hosting this program today with the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance. So I just want to sort of talk about a couple little technical notes again for anybody who's come in. We do generally ask that people keep themselves muted, especially when presentations are going on. We love seeing questions. Please use the chat function as much as possible for that. If you would like something sort of addressed immediately or there's an issue, you can also use the sort of the reactions or raising your hand option as well. We'll try to grab folks as needed for that. And again, just a general plug for VHS programs going on. We've got a bunch on our calendar for October and November, but the big one I want to share today is our annual League of Local Historical Societies and Museums Conference, which is going to be virtual this year. That's October 30th and 31st. And I will put the link to that information in the chat function, but it's a great sort of program with sessions on things like online exhibits and virtual summer camps and some great stuff that people have been doing, especially in relation to what we're going through now. And the folks, some of the folks from the CCCA will be joining us Saturday morning for that, for coffee and chat. So it's another good chance to talk with all these wonderful people again. So I'll put that in the chat for that. But at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Darlene, who's going to talk a little bit more about CCCA.
Excellent. Thank you, Eileen. And good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for our second workshop. Also, thank you, Eileen and the Vermont Historical Society for co-sponsoring this workshop with the Collections Care Alliance and for hosting us on the Zoom platform. My name is Darlene Bialowski, and I am a contract museum registrar and fine and decorative arts appraiser here in Southwest New Hampshire. My clients, which include museums, cultural organizations, historical societies, private collectors, artists, are from all over the country. I've worked in the museum field for over 25 years in places such as the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association, the Historic Deerfield, and the Springfield Museums in Springfield, Mass., where I was the sole registrar for 4 museums and 2 satellite exhibition spaces, which were at the Smith & Wesson Manufacturing Plant and Shooting Academy. I sit on the boards of Red Arch Cultural Heritage Law and Policy Research, and serve as its president. I also sit on the board of the Center for Painted Wall Preservation, and sit on the board for the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, and serve as its president. The Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, which we fondly call CCCA, was incorporated last year as a Vermont registered nonprofit. Our board is comprised of archivists, collections management professionals, conservators who live in Vermont, Eastern New York, and Western New Hampshire. It's a network of professionals working together to support the care and conservation of our region's cultural heritage collections and materials by way of providing information and education to individuals and entities caring for art, artifacts, historical records, and other collections. We work with cultural institutions, artists, private collectors, municipalities, and others to help improve collections care. So please check out our website. I'll be posting, if you didn't already see it in the beginning of the chat, I'll be posting it again in a few minutes. And there will be other information included throughout the webinar, which will all be included in an email to you as we follow up afterwards. We'd like to have you subscribe to our mailing list, which will give you an announcement in advance of any news or events or programs that we are participating in. And membership in the CCCA is now open. Details are on our website, and I encourage you to apply. We're planning some events for each of our membership categories, and if you're eligible to become a professional affiliate, our second networking opportunity in conversations with colleagues is tentatively scheduled for October 15th at the Norwich Historical Society in Norwich, Vermont, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., weather permitting. A third will be virtual and again co-sponsored with the Vermont Historical Society on November 17th, and that will be at 12 noon. We'll be organizing other such events in neighboring states as our memberships grow. And we are also working on programming for 2021, which will be a combination of in-person and virtual events. Both of our panelists this morning sit on the CCCA board. Rachel Onuf is the director of the Vermont Historical Records Program, based at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. In this role, she offers technical assistance to cultural heritage repositories through site visits and reports, workshops and trainings, and serving as an ongoing resource. In addition to the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, she's an active member of the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network, known as VARTDARM, and the Vermont Suffrages Centennial Alliance. Past jobs include serving as roving archivist for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and director of archives at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She taught as an adjunct for Simmons College School of Library and Information Science and worked as an independent consultant for many years. Erica Donnis is a graduate of the Winterthur Program in Early American Culture and has more than 20 years experience working with museums, archives, historical societies, and historic sites, both as an employee and consultant. She's based in Burlington, where she currently serves as Special Collections Director for Champlain College. Erica also manages a consulting practice specializing in curatorial, collections management, and exhibition projects. She serves as CCCA's secretary. And without further delay, may I introduce the webinar, Grants and Grant Writing for Collections Care. Ladies?
Darlene, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. So thrilled that you've joined us. Little bit of an agenda for you and a caveat. We're going to cover an awful lot of material in the next hour and a half or so, and I want this to be just an introduction to the topic and an introduction to us, to CCCA, and to my program specifically, in terms of being a resource for you as you conceptualize and draft and submit grant proposals. One of the things I do in my role is to help institutions with their grant proposals. I helped with a couple large NEH projects that are pending right now, and worked with the Department of Libraries in the last couple years to do a similar workshop to this that then led to libraries applying for IMLS, Accelerating Promising Practices grants. This was a really competitive program, and each year a Vermont library was successful in getting a community memory project grant funded. I also worked with an institution late this spring on an NEH Cares grant that was successful. And it's something I'm passionate about, both helping individual institutions and always kind of scheming about bigger grants that I could work on and develop that might help all of us in Vermont improve the way we're able to care for our collections, preserve them, and provide access to them. So always looking for collaborators and always looking for folks I can help with their own ideas. So with that in mind, I just want to say this is a topic I'm incredibly excited about, so I'm going to try to not go on and on and on and on. But I want to encourage you, and we'll come back to this at the end, encourage you to think of this as just the beginning, and we really do hope that we can build a cohort coming out of this webinar today that wants to work together in some fashion on their own proposals with support from us. So I'm going to talk about the kind of the big picture stuff relating to grants and grant writing, and then pass the baton over to Erica, and she'll dive into what you might want to be considering more specifically as you kind of horn in on what your proposal might be, what your project's going to try to cover. And questions, as Eileen said, it's difficult for me to see what's come in, but if she starts jumping up and down, I can see that on my Zoom, and we can either pause and have questions as they come up, or at the end. So without further ado, some of the things you want to think about as you think about grants, the big picture. The only other thing I'm going to say as way of introduction is that grants have been a huge part of my own professional life. I am currently grant funded in part. My first position 25 years ago, coming out of library school, was grant funded. And I've been a project archivist with Mellon Foundation funding and relied on National Historical Publications and Records Commission funding and HPRC funding many, many years, both in Massachusetts and currently in Vermont. So like it or not, grants are a reality, and they're part of how we fund ourselves and part of how we get our dreams fulfilled, of how we get what we want to get done at our repositories accomplished. In an ideal world, we would all be fully funded and not have to expend so many resources in terms of our own time and energy on developing these grants and following through with them. But it's the way it is. So I'm still grateful that they're out there. One really important thing to do, and this is why it's never too early to start thinking about about applying for a grant, is to make sure you're ready to. There is so much that you will be so grateful when you actually settle down to draft a project proposal and work on a narrative. You'll be so happy if you already have these things lined up. And of course, there's other good reasons institutionally why it's useful to have them in place. Mission statement. Know what it is what the reason is for why you are doing what you're doing. What's the purpose of your institution? Really important to have some sort of strategic plan, or at least some identified priorities. What is it that you want to try to achieve in order to fulfill your mission? That then should also be supported with policy and procedure documents specific to collections. If you're going for a collections related project proposal, you're going to want to make sure that you've got some sort of collection management plan in place, and perhaps even a preservation plan. And I can talk a bit more about that. It can be a standalone document that identifies how you are going to work toward preserving your collections, or it can be some component of your strategic plan. And that's kind of a whole side discussion on whether that should be a standalone plan or embedded within the strategic plan. The advantage of that is that it can be something that is seen within the larger realm of your institution's priorities, and not as kind of this sidebar that maybe only the collections people look at and think about. Also really important to make sure that there's institutional commitment, that you're not doing this alone. And I learned this the hard way. When I was at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, I saw an opportunity from the Grammy Foundation and was working with a volunteer who was interested in, we had a lot of old recordings on vinyl, and with him, the two of us together kind of whipped up a proposal and submitted it. We were not successful for all sorts of reasons, but it also was something where I sat down with the president and he said, you can't just go do this by yourself. You need to have our support. Where was this project going to actually happen in HSP? So you need to know that it's something that everyone is behind, and that it aligns with the other things that are trying to be achieved by other departments, other staff, depending how large you are. Data is huge, and we'll talk more about this later. What do you have to show that you've been taking care of your collection, that you are aware of how it's being used, that you're doing all you can to mitigate environmental concerns? It shows responsibility and responsiveness. So that's all going to help you as you make a case for your project. So good to have that, and to have been gathering that for some time. So if you don't have a means for tracking things, try to determine how you could start to count whether it's people using your website, people coming in or requesting access to collections virtually, monitoring your environmental conditions. All of that is really wonderful to be doing and to be able to show you have been doing. So it's never too early to start if you're not already tracking those types of things that can be quantified. Also great, and that's why it's wonderful to have you here on the webinar today, is to be aware of who's in your neighborhood, or who has expertise that you might want to call on as you're working on a project. And most conservators and other professionals, they're happy to talk to you about what you're thinking about for a project, and to help you shape that, and not just kind of write a letter of commitment saying, yes, I will. You know, if you wanted Michelle Pagan to work on your textile collection, you know, it wouldn't be just her mailing in a letter saying, yeah, I'll do the work. She would be, I'm sure, great, you know, glad to engage with you about, well, these are the textiles you really should focus on. Let's show that you've spent some time thinking about this in a thoughtful way before you actually ask for some money. So that's all kind of internal housekeeping stuff to be working on, and a lot of that is kind of ongoing, iterative activities. Hopefully, it aligns with some of the work that you are doing already for your organization. Also, good to kind of look up and look about you in terms of being aware of the scene, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some trends in what funders are seeking, and a bit about the two most common types of funding, government funding and foundation funding, some resources for locating funders, and how you might go about researching some funders once you've identified them. So increasingly, applications are only accepted online. So there's a presumption that you've got certain you've got the ability to do that, that you've got the facility to do that, and that you can kind of walk through the hoops. It can be peculiar because sometimes it's an online form and you have to kind of jump in and get it all in. You can't save until you submit. So you might want to, if you can, get into the environment in which you're supposed to submit your application in advance to make sure you kind of understand how it operates. Often is good to have actually drafted everything in advance, so you're only cutting and pasting into the boxes if it is a form-based online application process. In part because things are now online and because of increased need, there's a tremendous volume of proposals being received by funders for most of their opportunities, unless they're very well defined and only have a discrete type of project that they're interested in. So be aware that the competition can be pretty fierce. Many of the government funders will actually tell you what percentage of projects submitted in the last year were funded. So you can get a sense of whether is it kind of 37% are funded, or is it more like 9%? And that can be the kind of thing where that might determine whether it's going to be, whether it is an opportunity you want to pursue, or whether you want to maybe look for something that might be a little bit easier as an entry-level grant for you to receive, to be successful in getting. In part, kind of psychologically, just to kind of build up some momentum and a sense of success, and not just that you're getting lots of no's from funders. I cannot overstate the importance of a really compelling narrative, and that's why it's so critical to really focus on conceptualizing your project and framing it appropriately. And one of the things that often will trip up institutions, and it's happened to us at Vasara, it happened recently to another organization I work with. They were not, they did everything right, but they weren't able to convince the reviewers of the proposal of the significance of their material. And that's a tricky word. And a lot of funders, and this is more the government funders that are focusing on significance. Some of them have changed that, so it's not national significance necessarily, but it could be okay if to only have local or state significance, but you still have to make that case and make it convincing that these materials are indeed really significant for your locality. Measurable deliverables, and they may be called performance objectives or performance measures. Sometimes proposals also request not only kind of the list of things you are going to have accomplished at the end, the products of the grant, but they're going to ask you to evaluate that and how successful the entire project was. The IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services in particular, the librarians are really into evaluation, and that's often a component of their grants. And we're gonna bang on you about this one as well. Interest in alignment of proposed project with your institution's strategic plan. It's gotta, and that's why it's good to have that mission statement, that strategic plan, and those policy and procedure documents to kind of show, and this is why we're trying to do this. It helps you build that rationale for why this project right now makes sense for your institution. Other things to keep in mind, there's less of an interest now, and this was about 20 years ago when digitization was becoming the thing. You know, it was very easy to get money to digitize some stuff, to put up some stuff online. And it didn't have to kind of connect to anything really. It just was kind of, you could do this. You could have this you know, standalone exhibit on whatever topic. But now there's interest in, again, how is this connecting not only to your larger plan for what you're trying to accomplish, but how is it going to help you build capacity? What's going to be the long-term impact of this successful project? And how are you going to sustain it over time? And that can be one of the hardest things, because it often is that you're bringing in project staff. It might be that you're bringing in project staff, or you're bringing in an outside contractor to do some work. And then how do you sustain that over time? One of the reasons I think the most recent IMLS APP, Accelerating Promising Practices proposal, was successful is that the More Free Library in Newfane committed to, after the end of the project, continuing to pay their librarian for an additional 3 or 4 hours of work a week in order to continue to do community memory work. So showing that with this little boost from you all to get us through kind of a big push in this project for the next 2 years, we're going to commit to maintaining it over time by actually designating some of our money from this point forward for this work. So that's going to resonate really well with the funder. There also is a lot of interest in collaborative projects. Again, part of why I get excited about trying to figure out how can I work with the Historical Society, the Folklife Center, with UVM, with smaller repositories throughout the state to do something that's coordinated, that shows how we're all working together. That's something that funders are really interested in seeing. And increasingly an interest in reaching underserved communities. And that can be defined in many ways. Sometimes the funder will define it and will explicitly say what groups it is looking to reach. And in other cases, they will look to you to identify what's the underserved community in your locality. Who would you want to try to serve who you're not reaching now? So you can see how this can tie in with larger institutional awareness of their place within their community and what it is that you are providing, what are you not providing that you could be providing, and to try to figure out how all of that fits together. So we're not talking so much today about private individuals and law firms and businesses and other folks who may well be able to be approached to fund your work. I've been working with the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance for a couple years now, and for the fundraising, you know, it's been a kind of big combination of all sorts of different types of funding, including the individuals. And it may be that there's folks on your board or people in your community who you know have a specific interest that you can work with. But for today, we're really going to focus on government and foundation sources. So just to think about, there's kind of key distinctions of these two types. Government funding, it's usually set by legislation. You know, NHPRC, it says what they can fund and who they can give the money to. Their application processes, they do change, but they tend to be the same for each passing year. They do occasionally play around with new opportunities. So it's always good to kind of look through what's available on a fairly regular basis, and to know what they're doing. You know, NEH had a community heritage program that lasted 2 or 3 years, and then it went away. But it was a low-level grant that was easier for smaller institutions to apply for and be successful with. So good when you can find something like that. They tend to have really firm deadlines, but they also offer often the opportunity for you to have your draft read by a program officer. And I have full disclosure, I have never done that, but I really think people should. So don't listen to me. I tend to be a last minute, intense up to the wire grant submitter, but I don't follow what I do. I know others have worked with program officers and had them review grant drafts, and that's immensely helpful. So that's really good. That's good to do. They can offer you technical assistance as well, which they kind of need to do because some of them do require, especially the federal grants, require you to have, and Erica will get into this, you have to have multiple kinds of accounts set up, and they have to be done weeks in advance, and you have to be able to navigate their technological environment, which can be really challenging. But don't let that stop you from applying. They are more bureaucratic. It's just going to be kind of more like a massive tanker ship if you're trying to kind of get movement or action or response. It can sometimes seem pretty lugubrious, and even just kind of the amount of time that passes. You know, I submitted a grant to the NHPRC in June. I got questions from staff and peer reviewers in September, and the commission's actually going to vote on it in November. And at some point in December, we'll find out if we're successful. You know, so you got to kind of assume there's going to be a big lead time there. But they are usually good on their websites. They'll kind of tell you what the different deadlines are and what the expectations should be for you and for them. These applications, however, are usually much lengthier. You know, the typical narrative can be 20 pages for explaining your project. And there's going to be more requirements, and it may be internal forms you have to fill out. It may be that you need to, you know, not only have a narrative, but also have a plan of work and a timeline and you know, various types of attachments and appendices that really extend the whole process. And you need to report. So the grants that I've been working under recently, it's only every year that we need to report. But some of them it's going to be every 6 months, depending on sometimes the length of the grant itself, and sometimes on the funder. But they usually want to hear something about how it's going. But that's not a bad thing, because it's an opportunity to for you to kind of check in on how it's going. And if you are falling behind or have other things that have made you decide you want to actually change the path of what your project's going to be a little bit, it's an opportunity to have a conversation with the funder about, you know, can I switch this a little bit, or, you know, we're not traveling. So the budget had $30,000 for traveling. Can I move that to getting software for remote interviewing? You know, that kind of stuff. So that's a good opportunity to engage in conversations with your funder. And they often provide more funding. I mean, the more money the government gives you, the more money they expect you to come up with for a match or a cost share. So some of the big challenge grants can give you millions of dollars, but you've got to also be coming up with sometimes it's a 1-to-1 match, meaning if you're getting $1 million, you need to come up with $1 million. The thing is, you can match with other sources of funding. It's not that you've got to build that out of your own accounts. It may be that you can apply for foundation funding and use that as match for your government grant. And it may be that you're allowed to include as part of your cost share staff time spent on the grant. So there's different ways that you can build up that match requirement. And for some of the smaller grants that we think you all might want to consider starting with, there's often no need for any kind of cost share, which makes them also more appealing and more realistic for smaller organizations to actually try to go for. Foundation funding, one of the biggest challenges is for some of them, you need to be invited to apply. You can't just lob your application in. It may be a better source for your local needs. There's some foundations that, they're interested in projects in the Northeast Kingdom or in the Upper Connecticut River Valley or in Rutland City and Town. So knowing what they are, Windham has a bunch that are specific to Windham. For Windham County. So it may be that there's opportunity there because there's not going to be as much competition, right? Because you're not applying along with the rest of the country. Only certain geographic, it's often geographic bounds are able to apply. And it can be a better place to start if you haven't gotten any grant funding in the past. The best thing about proposals for foundations is that they're less complex. Even when I applied for funds from the Mellon Foundation, and we had to be invited, so we took the train up from Philadelphia and had an audience with the Mellon Foundation program officers and pitched. It was a contingent from Philadelphia, and then we had 3 different organizations, and we all pitched different proposals, and then went away. But then when we were invited to apply, the actual application was kind of like an extended letter. And more recently, I applied to the Bissell Foundation here in Vermont, and it was a 2-page letter. So that it's so much that I then emailed to my contact, rather than having to kind of go through an online application apparatus like you have to if you're applying for a federal grant. And they're easier to administer. They tend to be a little more casual, a little more flexible. But they might not be able to offer as much support. So they're not going to read a draft. They may not get back to you right away. And if you're not successful, they may not explain the rejection, even though you should always ask why you did not receive funds. So these are some of the main funders. And again, federal is a huge part of this pot, but there's also state level resources to be available that you should be aware of. Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And I should at this point also mention the Preservation Trust of Vermont. And they have a number of grant programs. Both VDHP and Preservation Trust, they're focused more on the buildings, but I certainly believe that in some ways your building is part of your collection often, and can be the first line of defense between the elements in your collections. So caring for your collections includes, and often the first step in caring for your collections should be making sure that your building is stable and secure. So we're not going to talk a lot about buildings, but be aware that there are funds at the state level in Vermont for taking care of buildings. Vermont Arts Council is another, with their cultural facilities grant, is another opportunity for, and it's a little broader often than the VDHP and Preservation Trust opportunities, in that cultural facilities grants can also be used not just for improving, your roof, but can also be used to mitigate against risk of having disasters happen. So you can get some funds to put in flood doors or other things that might help. They're also really into funding projects that are going to make your facility more accessible. So ramps, bigger doors, automatic doors, that kind of stuff. So good opportunities there as well. And there's the possibility that you can get some funds at the municipal level as well. And this is, I know we've got some folks from Massachusetts on the webinar, so, and I'm familiar with the environment down there from my years as roving archivist. And one thing Massachusetts has that Vermont does not is the Community Preservation Act funds. And I know communities that have used those funds to hire collections care and archivists to do work. And that was within, again, it's decided at the municipal level how those funds will be used. But in some municipalities, they've been successful in using that money for collections care projects. So it may be that there's stuff at the local level as well. So there's a couple tools I like for doing some research on foundations. And I'll show you just a couple screenshots in a moment. And also just to think about your peer institutions as a great resource. For the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance, and it's slightly different, but the chair of our fundraising committee, one of the ways she did research was to see in the programs for the Flynn Center and other cultural institutions to look and see who the ads were from in the program, and to then kind of develop a list of potential prospects based on that, thinking these are folks who care about culture, maybe they'll care about the Suffrage Alliance, and that's proven somewhat successful even in a pandemic. So being creative about how you locate sources, but also kind of seeing who else has given money to whom. So looking at announcements of where grants have come in, where does their funding come from? You know, look at their annual reports, look at their websites. Where are they getting the money they need for additional projects? And so this is the Foundation Center's Visualizing Funding for Libraries tool. And don't be turned off by the libraries part, because it's actually broader than that. So this is just an example of a search I did on it for funding in support of art conservation or museums in Vermont from 2006 to present. And it will come up with, and you can look at all of this stuff in detail, but you'll see at the highest level, there's 72 grants in that time period that valued 1.6 million, 26 different funders. So that's a pretty big spread. 5 recipients. Okay, so there's 5 institutions in Vermont that have been really successful at getting funding for this type of work. And you can look in and see that, yeah, the Calvin Coolidge Memorial Foundation, St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. And another way to look at it, they also, because it is a visual tool, they show you things like this. So you can see Calvin Coolidge is the big yellow dot, and that shows how the connections go, like who's getting money, where's their overlap, where is there kind of outliers. So again, you can find out more details in this tool about how much money and for what type of project did they fund. So it's pretty powerful, and it's bigger than just libraries, and you can look for different types of activity within different types of institutions. So just to give you a sense of that. We also have the Vermont Community Foundation Grantmaker database, and in the last year they've spruced this up. It's a much nicer interface than it was. So I just did a search for museums and archives and special collections in Vermont, and came up with quite a few options. And again, you can look in and see, and it will tell you, it gives you an idea of how, and you can start to kind of build up a list of prospects based on this. And you might say, who's these Florida people and what are they giving money? Well, they're only giving $750. I'm not going to worry about that. But who's given the most money and where have they given it? So if you look at it, if you click on one of them, you'll get more information about the foundation and what they are interested in funding, and whether you can contact them or not, and whether it's invitation only. So this can be helpful. And this is the Bissell Foundation and again, I found out about it not by doing internet research, but I knew that the Vermont Historical Society has regularly received funds from them to digitize movies films of Vermont subjects. And Bissell has a website, so I was actually able to look and see what other projects they had funded in previous years, and then developed a proposal for the Suffrage Centennial Alliance to have a documentary filmmaker do a short film about the history of the suffrage movement in Vermont and document to some extent our activities as an alliance as we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. That's, of course, been somewhat complicated, as was the approval process. They weren't able to meet in March, so we just found out last week that we were successful. And since the centennial will be extending into 2021, there may well be the opportunity to get some live footage, as well as some stills from the things that did happen either virtually or in person this last year. So these resources can help you locate potential sources that you might not find otherwise. A lot of foundations are elusive in that they don't have websites and they're not really advertising the fact that they give out money. So it can be challenging, and it can take some time to do this research in terms of identifying potential funders. So if they have a site, you can look at it, see when they give out money. Is it once a year? Is it quarterly? And you can see, find out as much as you can through, and again, this is the part of the time-consuming prep work. Make sure you're familiar with what they're doing, and try to identify the funders that best fit your priorities. And again, this is really one of the major takeaways I hope from this morning's webinar. Resist the temptation to chase the money. If there's an opportunity out there that's offering some kind of funds for doing work that is not at all what you were planning to do in the next 5 years and is not really connected to your larger strategic plan, really think long and hard. In some cases, it's going to make sense to change track a little bit and find a way to incorporate that into something that you would be willing to do. But for the most part, you don't want to be distracted by those options. And you really want to try to continue to think about what it is you're trying to achieve for your collections, and what's the most logical set of steps, and who are the best funders for those steps, and not to just jump for the brand new thing. Yeah, so you're going to want to make contacts if you can with these funders. Again, easier to do with government funders. Those program officers are there to help you, but maybe less easy with what but those contacts could also be with, Calvin Coolidge and with St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. So, hey guys, so what kind of projects did you get such success with, and how did you interact with the funders? So it can be useful, and I think there's, by and large, going for grants, it tends to be, I don't think it's overly competitive in that they would be unwilling to talk to you about what they've done or how they'd approached their funders or what they've learned through the whole process. I think folks tend to be really generous with that kind of information. And then there's also folks like Eileen and myself and other members of CCCA who can help you as well, as you're getting into this process. So again, just to reiterate this point, and maybe do you want to pause, or I'll pause, I'm sure you want me to pause. I'm pausing. Are there questions that we should engage with at this point, or do any of my fellow CCCA members want to jump in and offer any kind of information?
I'll jump in.
Thanks, John.
Okay, sorry, I could tell if you could hear me. I would just echo a lot of what Rachel has been saying, in that, there are professionals in the area that are very happy to work with you on grant applications. And like she said, it's way more than just writing a letter of commitment. It's really helping you decide what sort of projects are most suitable and how to help develop a more convincing grant application, working with you on the narrative if that's something you want help with. But there are a lot of us here that really enjoy doing these grant funded projects, so don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to do that, and that's part of our mission as preservation professionals.
And I'll jump in.
Darlene, you're muted.
How did that happen? I'd also like to jump in and say that if you've applied for a grant and you weren't successful, please don't think that that's the end of it. Don't, not to move forward. Look for other funding sources, as Rachel has explained. Find what matches you and apply again. Reach out to a professional, someone on the CCCA board, anyone that's been mentioned, and ask them to look things over for you and see where maybe your weaknesses are and where you need to strengthen something, and then apply again, because you will eventually be successful.
Oh, and I can't resist. I see Lauren Glenn Davidian is on the webinar at CCTV and CCTV. And one of the groups that I'd love to work with are the cable access stations. And again, that's a great opportunity and I know there've been preliminary conversations about preserving your assets. So, that's something where, and my tendency is to try to think big. So sometimes I need to be reined back into, no, we need to focus on what we need here at our station. But I also am always looking for ways that we can leverage your need. If you have need, others probably in similar situations have the same needs, and can we amplify that and apply together? So I would like to talk with you more about what we could do to move that forward.
And I just want to say, Eileen has dropped into the chat box another source for a great small grant program. So be sure that you check out that website as well.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Eileen. That's something that when I was reviewing some possibilities for the Old Stonehouse Museum to consider applying for, I noticed, it's not a lot of money, but they have to give one to Vermont every year. And a couple institutions have gotten grants more than once. My sense is because they're not getting a lot of applications from Vermont. So it's also partly knowing sensing what the opportunities are. Again, this is one where they have to take someone from Vermont. A lot aren't bothering to apply, so the odds are better. Okay, well, I think, Erica, I'm gonna mute myself and let you take over.
All right, everybody. I am taking over the second half of our presentation and focusing a little bit more, taking us from the macro, a little bit more closely looking at specifics for preparing your application, your proposal for a specific project. So we'll be talking about diving in, how to conceptualize your specific project, preparing to draft your proposal. We'll be sharing a lot of tips and strategies for you for developing that proposal, and also talking about some common concerns. So let's move on to conceptualizing. So definitely you want to make sure that your project is aligned with not only your own organization's values, interests, and needs, but also with the interests of the funding agency that you're thinking about applying to. So hopefully, I would think the best case scenario would be if you developed kind of a wish list of projects that you wanted to accomplish, say in the next 5 years, and then kind of look to see what's out there for granting programs at the federal level and the foundation level that might fulfill one or more of those projects. And so you're going to be, kind of going back and forth between big picture strategic thinking, doing your research on what's out there for funding, and also in-house kind of looking at what your priorities are for specific collections care needs. So you're also at the same time, hopefully, thinking about how to work with others to further flesh out your project ideas. If it's a project where you'll have collaborators within your community, maybe reach out and have a preliminary conversation, and get some agreement and some momentum so moving forward, so that before you actually start drafting a proposal, you have a commitment from your partners to move forward. So you're not wasting time developing that specific proposal without making sure that you have the partners that you need in hand. And that goes for both other organizations, if you're partnering with other organizations, and also collections professionals who can work with you on projects. We would definitely also advise you to start small. If you haven't necessarily applied for funding for collections care projects before, you might want to start with an assessment. So where that is, where someone might come in and provide you with some kind of big picture advice about how to handle your collections in a number of different areas. And with that an assessment in hand, you can then go out and seek funding for specific projects. So particularly when you're starting out for seeking funding for collections projects, you want to set real and realistic goals. So what's appropriate for both for your collection and your organization? Are you a small shop with a small staff or all entirely volunteer based? So have those conversations among yourselves and your board about what's realistic, what you can accomplish. Maybe focus on going after one project at a time rather than trying to spread yourselves thin and trying to hit every deadline that's coming up. So when you actually sit down to start working on your proposal, you definitely want to make sure that you are aware of all the pieces that need to come together. So what is the funder requiring for a narrative, for the budget, for bios for all of the staff, for the appendices? Develop a list, a checklist for yourself if there isn't one that's in the package. Read and reread those guidelines over and over, making sure that you fit their criteria. Are you the right kind of organization for the project? Do your collections meet their specifications? Do you have the staff that you need? Some of the federal programs, for example, require that you have a full-time staff member or the volunteer equivalent. So before you spend a lot of time and effort working on a proposal, make sure that you meet those guidelines. And this would be a really good time to get in touch with a program officer if there's a contact person that you can reach. Sound them out first before you put anything in writing. Also, make sure that your grant application is targeted to that specific program or that specific funder. There may be pieces that you can cut and paste between different applications, but you definitely want to make sure that your proposal is specific, it's not generic, so that so that you have demonstrated to the funder that you know about what they're interested in funding and that you are committed to making sure that you meet their guidelines. Definitely making sure that you stay on task in terms of timing with meeting those deadlines is critical, particularly the larger federal programs. Putting that proposal together does take time, both internally as far as writing the narrative and assembling all the pieces. And if there's a partner on board, whether it be an organization in your community or an external professional that you're working with, you need to make sure that there's enough lead time to get those letters of commitment, to flesh out the specific pieces of the project that involve them, that there's time for some back and forth so that you're not putting everything together at the 11th hour and missing some specifics that your reviewers might have questions about because it was a rush to the finish line. Definitely remember that grantors really do want to give out money. They have these pots of money, and that's their whole reason for being, right? So have those conversations with the officers really early on. They'll be encouraging if they think your project is a good fit for their program. And definitely, I want to reiterate what Carolyn said, I believe, that if your proposal is not successful the first time around, make sure that you reach out and ask for feedback so that you can either reapply for that particular program the next time that funding cycle comes along, or that you can use that feedback to apply for another project. So you're building on the process and getting better and better at submitting proposals as time goes on. Here's some tips for writing a successful proposal. First, see what else is out there. Oftentimes, funding agencies will post examples of other proposals from previous funding cycles that have been successful. So what worked for those organizations that might be a conceptual framework for you, and how are they structuring the actual project, the work plan? How are they structuring their narrative? All of those pieces can help inform you and help you craft a better proposal. We can't state more frequently enough that you need to make sure that you're following the funder's guidelines. So do you have your checklist in front of you? Have you made sure that all the pieces that you need to submit are ready to go, and that the numbers and concepts match up from one document to the next? So something that happens frequently is that sometimes there's a change towards the last minute in terms of the budget or the staff or some other aspect of the plan. And so you need to make sure, double check that your budget document, the numbers in your budget document match what you say in the project narrative, for example, or that you've listed all of the staff in the narrative and included their bios or their CVs if you need to include those as the appendices. So make sure all those pieces line up. Definitely, this is your opportunity to shine. You know, every organization has its strength, has its greatest hits as far as collections are concerned, and you are the best person to tell your story. So this is a great opportunity for you to talk about your organization and to show your passion for your project. So definitely also be thinking about the significance of your collection. Rachel mentioned this early on, and I want to reiterate it. Some funders are very clear that you need to be able to demonstrate national significance. And if that's the case, then make sure you follow those guidelines. But in any case, for any proposal, it's really important that you're telling the funders and the reviewers why this project is significant to you. Are the collections really important to your community? Are the items that are the focus of your project the ones that are the most heavily used by your patrons? Are they the pieces that you are planning to put in your headliner exhibition for the next year? So it's definitely really important to make sure that you're conveying the significance of the collections in question to your organization and to your audience. Also, I can't state this more. Make sure that you've tested out your proposed workflow or your methodology in advance. If you are going to have volunteers be rehousing photographs or documents, for example, do a trial run, even if you don't have the appropriate acid-free materials on hand. Make sure that you know how much time it takes for one person to refolder a box of manuscripts, for example, if that's a key component of your project. Same thing goes for digital assets. If you are digitizing collections, or if you are cataloging materials or inventorying them, do a dry run as much as possible with the staff and supplies and equipment that you have on hand, so you have a good sense of how long it's going to take, and state that clearly in your proposal. It definitely will impress your your reviewers if you can say, I did a time trial. These are the results of the time trial. Here's the trial and error that we've already worked out. Excuse me, those kinds of aspects will go a long way with your reviewers. So, excuse me, another tip is have some boilerplate language ready to go that you can massage for a specific project. This will save you time when it gets to the point of writing a specific proposal and allow you to change and adapt as necessary going forward. So have a paragraph available on the history of your organization and your collections ready to go so that you can slip that into your narrative. Likewise, make sure that you have your 501c3 documentation ready to roll so that you don't waste valuable time trying to track down the copy that you need to submit. And if this is allowed, include photographs or images of the materials in question. And those could be like wow snapshots of the greatest hits of your collection that are part of your proposal, but they could also be the before pictures of what showing what the current status or the current condition of your collection is that you hope to mitigate with this particular project. So don't be afraid to show the funder and the reviewer a little bit of your dirty laundry, because everyone's got it, and you're really demonstrating the need there. And also, images are just great eye candy for reviewers who are reading one application after another. If they can see an image every now and again, it really breaks up the day and helps, and it will make your proposal stand out. Speaking of making your proposal stand out and making it easier for the reviewers to go through, think about things like using bullet points and white space, using clear and concise language. Oftentimes there is a page limit or a word limit for project narratives, and those are really helpful actually because they make you be more concise, and they make sure that the reviewers don't start tuning you out if they have to read 20 pages versus 5. Coming up with a catchy title really helps too, particularly if you're submitting a proposal to a federal program where you know the reviewers are going to be each responsible for reviewing, say, up to 10 proposals in one go. If you've come up with a catchy title, you've set yourself apart, and it will make it easier for people to remember your project. Avoid jargon. Keep in mind that particularly if your project has a technical aspect, not all of your reviewers or the program officers will be particularly familiar with the specifics of the technical aspect. So make sure that you are being clear and that you've referenced those technical specifications as best practices in the field, perhaps slipped in a web link so that people could do more research if they were interested. But make sure that your proposal is written in plain English for people coming from a variety of aspects of the arts and cultures fields to be able to review it without getting stuck. And just a few more tips for you. Substantive support letters. Do you have a municipal leader who can write a letter of support? Or do you have someone who's representative of a patron group that would benefit from this, this project? Do you have an affinity group that is interested in the particular component of your collections that you're seeking funding for? So definitely include those support letters, and it's okay if you draft the bulk of the support letter for someone to review and tweak and then sign for you. that will save them a lot of time, and you'll get more buy-in for those support letters if you can show that you've started the process for them, if there's less work for them to do. You definitely want to use outside readers, both colleagues and generalists. For any project, when you are doing a deep dive in your head into a particular project, it's really easy to get lost in the weeds and forget a critical aspect because you're so closely involved in it. It's really important to have someone copy edit your proposal, because certainly I know, at least for me, I could read something, a drafts 20 times and still miss a glaring copy edit error that it's in, because it's my own work, and my eyes just gloss right over that. And definitely go back to that checklist of all the different aspects of the proposal that you need to submit, and make sure that you are following the guidelines. Are you submitting things in the correct order? Sometimes there's specific instructions for file names or file formats. Making sure that you have all your pieces ready to go when you are ready to submit is really important. I want to go back to the importance of the wow factor. I think we've referenced this a couple times. Images are really great for doing this, catchy titles, and even, the airing some aspects of your dirty laundry, being honest and transparent about the fact that you're not meeting best practices in certain areas and that you're using this grant as a stepping stone to get there. That will be really impressive to your reviewers, and could make all the difference. Okay, a couple other considerations here. What to expect when working with a consultant, with an outside professional. Keep in mind that conservators and collections care professionals are probably being approached by several different organizations to meet a certain funding deadline, especially for the bigger federal grants. So it's really important, while all of those projects, a professional can probably handle the implementation, it's really important to give them enough lead time to be able to provide you the information that you need and to work with you to shape the aspect of the project they're involved with, and do that with enough advance notice so that they have time to adequately support you. Typically, the parts of the proposal that a consultant might help you shape or support would be, in addition to supplying a letter of commitment that would outline in clear and concise terms what they'll be responsible for, what their deliverables are, and what their requirements are as far as compensation. They will often supply you with a bio or a resume for different components of your proposal. And they can also help you hammer out what your project work plan is, and be a really good kind of provide some back and forth support over whether your budget for supplies is realistic, and your timeline, the timeline that you have in mind, is also realistic. Keep in mind that particularly for the larger federal programs, you will need to have registered with them ahead of time before you can apply for a grant. And that's something that you want to do at least several weeks in advance, if not longer, so that you can have all your ducks in a row and focus on the actual proposal in the days leading up to the deadline. So Rachel chime in if you have some more specific guidance on the DUNS number or the grants.gov registration information that people need to put together.
Oh, just that you need to have a DUNS number, and then you have to register for a SAM account. That's for the awards. That's the award management system that the federal government uses. And grants.gov is the environment in which you actually submit your application. And there've been lags of up to 3 or 4 weeks before the SAM and the grants.gov get activated. Another thing to, and this is what it caught us up, you also need to keep those accounts active. And there's I think it's called an eBiz POC. So the point of contact POC for your entity, your organization within these environments needs to be identified, and you need to renew your registration on a fairly regular timetable. So we got caught because our eBiz POC was on a vacation very far away and we needed to renew. And so it's something to just kind of, again, it doesn't, as long as you're aware of it and you keep it in your calendar as a, need to do this, it shouldn't trip you up, but it's something to really be aware of, that until you become real comfortable with it, it can grind your entire vision to a halt, because you can't, you're too late.
Okay, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about the budget, specifics on the budget. Rachel mentioned before different strategies for coming up with a cost share. You definitely want to look at the guidelines for the particular program that you're thinking about applying to, but keep in mind that oftentimes staff time or volunteer time can be used as a match. And also other forms of cost sharing, you might have individual donors, perhaps people who are on your board or people who are friends of yours in the local community that you could approach to contribute to that cost match. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have your cost share match identified and making sure that you're meeting the guidelines for that before you submit your proposal. So I know it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation here, because each party, the grantor and the potential contributors to the cost share match, if it's a cash match, often want to know that the other party is already committed. So sometimes you can go back and forth on that a little bit. But to the best of your ability, your proposal will be much more successful if you have a solid cash match in hand or a commitment thereof before you submit your proposal. And oftentimes the funding organization or agency will require that in your proposal. Also, it's important to note that reviewers are looking out for people who are padding their budget. And that goes for not only adding a little bit to the actual cash aspects of your budget, but also padding it out by putting in extra staff time beyond what is necessary. So this, again, is where your time trials, your methodology, specific aspects of your project work plan can really help you out. Can you demonstrate that your director is really going to spend 10% of their time supervising the project and preparing the reports that are required for this grant? Can you demonstrate that your volunteers are really going to put in 30 hours over 2 months with the actual aspects of the rehousing work that you have in mind? So finally, some other strategies to consider. One is the phased approach. We've already mentioned this a little bit. Applying for funding for an assessment first and using that assessment report to strengthen your case for follow-up funding for a specific project. And certain funders that are out there actually have structured their grants this way so that there is kind of a phased approach. But definitely the more that you can show that you've done your homework, that you have that assessment in hand, that will be a really great strategy for you to demonstrate your need to a funder for an actual follow-up project that benefits the collection. Also, don't forget the backdoor approach. You can always find ways to tack on small amounts of collections care projects to another project that is primarily focused on programs. So for example, I recently got a public humanities grant, and so that has a very clear deliverable in terms of an event and a student research component, but I was able to argue successfully that I needed $250 for acid-free folders to rehouse the collection that the students were going to be looking at in the reading room in order to have them safely handle those materials so that they could produce the product that they were going to produce for the grant. Another example might be if you're applying for funding for an exhibition, you could roll in the cost of conservation or conservation quality framing into your exhibition project. And those are aspects that are definitely have direct benefit to your collection, but are very real costs for a specific program or exhibition, and that make a lot of sense to bundle with a program project. So some common concerns, some things to keep in mind, some pitfalls, potential pitfalls. Lack of communication with a program officer. It's definitely best practice to get in touch with a program officer in advance if you can. And certain funders will kind of look askance at your project if you've submitted a proposal but you haven't done this. So make sure that you've done your homework and figured out who requires it and who strongly advises it. Some projects require you to submit a draft first before you submit your final proposal. And that communication piece is really important. Make sure that you're following the latest guidelines from your funding agency or foundation. Oftentimes, we are all looking ahead one funding cycle, which is great to plan in advance. But then the latest guidelines are posted, say, 6 weeks or 2 months before an actual deadline. And it's really important to make sure that you're using the guidelines from the current funding cycle to prepare your actual proposal. If your collections are poorly described or quantified, your reviewers will have a hard time knowing if your scope of work, if your calendar, if your budget is adequate and realistic and accurate. So it's fine to say, we have approximately 2,000 photographs that are currently housed in 6 boxes or take up a certain amount of linear feet. You may not have a specific number ahead of time, but the closer you can get, the better. If you are targeting a specific type of collection, you're going to want to give your reviewers a sense of the format involved, the material type, as well as the quantity. So instead of saying textiles, well, what do you mean by textiles? Are we talking about garments? Are we talking about needlework? Images, for example, are we talking about print photography? Are we talking about slides? Are we talking about digital images? Maybe your project is dealing with multiple types or formats. And so if you can give reviewers a sense of how many of each type or format you have that are going to be covered in this project, that will be really helpful information. It's important to make sure that your project work plan is pretty detailed. So have you, which aspects of the project are you going to focus on in which phase? which aspects would an outside professional be helping you with? So what are specific people involved in the project working on? What are the different aspects of the project or the different phases? How long do you anticipate each phase taking? And which aspects do you need the supplies that you've asked for? Typos. Of course, reviewers are going to be forgiving for, everyone, no matter how good they are, is going to submit a proposal that has a few typos or other copy edit issues. But if your proposal is full of misspellings or spacing errors or other typos, you've started yourself off on the wrong foot with your reviewers, because they're going to wonder if you kind of put this together slapdash at the last minute, or if this is really a strategic project that is something that you've been working for long term. Letters of commitment, letters of support, those are really essential, and oftentimes they're required when you're going to be working with a community partner organization or a conservator or other collections care professional. But even if they're not required and you're able to put them in as an attachment, that's a best practice to do that. Same thing with letters of support. If you have a municipal government, a mayor, or someone else from a friends group, they can certainly provide really important documentation that your project is indeed important to your community. Missing information on project staff. Sometimes resumes are required, and so they should be part of the checklist that you're preparing when you're figuring out what you need to submit with your proposal. Certainly, if attachments or appendices are allowed, resumes or like a bio page where you put in a paragraph about each person who's working on the project are definitely strongly encouraged. Budget errors, I referenced this earlier. So not only talking about making sure that you've done the math correctly here, but also that the numbers that you're submitting on your budget sheet match the numbers that you've written in your narrative and other parts of the documentation. Okay, so we are ready to roll. We're really hoping that you're interested in perhaps joining a cohort of people who are applying for upcoming grants. There are a number of opportunities coming up in the next 3 to 4 months, both on the federal level and also more locally. Carolyn, I don't know if you want to speak to this particular grant opportunity, which is coming up on November 1st. I'd certainly love to have you weigh in on it, since you, I think, have been involved with at least one proposal so far.
Sure. So this was a grant that sort of went away for a little while, and I was very pleased to see that it has come back this year, and the deadline is coming right up, November 1st. But this is a really great project that the American Institute of Conservation partners with TrueView Optium, who makes preservation, museum quality, UV filtering plexiglass. And it basically, it's a very easy application to fill out. It's one of those sort of low key applications that Rachel and Erica both talked about. And basically you can use it to apply to have conservation treatment done on one or several items in a collection. And then that object or series of objects would then be framed or displayed with the UV filtering plexiglass that's donated from TrueView. I've done projects where there were several historic prints that we treated in the conservation studio and then were framed and matted using these museum quality archival materials. And then I also did an interesting project where a library had an antique barrister's bookcase that they wanted to use for displaying objects from their historic collection. And they actually sent the bookcase out to be retrofitted with the UV filtering plexi. So you can be creative. And they were really excited to have something a little bit more interesting to work on down at Small Core, Massachusetts for that. So again, it's a pretty quick application process. Feel free to reach out to anyone at CCCA if you need help finding a consultant to work with, and we're happy to walk you through the application process, even though it's getting a little down to the wire, but that's, I think both Rachel and Erica said, that's kind of the nature of the beast of grant applications. So I would at least encourage you to check it out and see if you can think of something in your collection that would be a good candidate for this.
Yeah, and this might be and one of those examples of something where it is an opportunity and it's not going to take a huge amount of your time and effort to pursue. So maybe you do kind of do a side detour and see if this is, and it may be that there's a latent need, like, oh yes, that thing that the board president has hanging in the office really should be protected better. Let's do that because there's this funding available. But yeah, and you would want to just kind of, this is the kind of the first thing you might look at. So, I hope that as you read through this, you're thinking about some of the stuff that Erica and I have talked about. So yeah, one thing I would flag is it's due November 1st. All right, so you gotta kind of jump on this one. Kind of skimming. You have to know what the hell glaze. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that they also will have a second application deadline on May 1st. But I don't know that for sure, but that's sort of what was hinted at. So if you can't get it together for November 1st, but you have something that you think would be a good project, keep checking on the AIC website, and it will update you when it's time to apply for the second round of funding.
Right, and it's always totally legitimate to, if you do make contact with program officer, say, hey, I'm really interested in this. That deadline's coming up really quick. Will this opportunity be offered again? And they might be cagey, but they might be able to give you some real definite information there about whether or not, like, yeah, this is one and done, or yeah, we intend to offer this again in 2021. So again, you won't know that unless you talk to them, or you talk to CCCA and someone like Carolyn's got an inside track. So there's, again, just to have your feelers out and to be in communication with people. So yeah, just looking through this, like, what is a glazing application? That might be a question, like, what's the terminology? Do I even know what they're offering here? And then kind of, you gotta be a not-for-profit, okay. Gotta be located here, okay. Must have at least one full-time conservator on staff, or a conservator on contract. So I would want to initiate, one of my immediate goals here, if I was interested in this opportunity, would be to reach out to a conservator or reach out to CCCA and say, hey, I'm interested in this. Who do you know among the professional affiliates that would be an appropriate person to work with on this proposal? And then making sure that the funds are going to be able to be of use to you in terms of what they're going to cover. And it looks like that might work. How much? Up to $3,000. And the free glazing, no indication that you've got to come up with any money. So then again, there's a link, so I would go read more, but on the preliminary review, it's kind of, okay, this might actually fly, assuming you do have something that ought to be reglazed or glazed for the first time because you would love to be able to display it. So I think at this point, we are coming on time. I just want to reiterate that we really want to work with you, and I'm going to send out a list of some of these modest grants that we think are good for starting with to everyone who's on the webinar, and a quick questionnaire just to see if you're interested in being part of a cohort, or if you want to have time to talk one-on-one about some ideas you have and to bat some stuff around. I would love to do that, and depending on the type of project you're thinking of, I might connect you with someone else on CCC3A who might be more appropriate for you to be advised by. So let's see if there's any questions for us.
Rachel, I'm going to jump in. There's a question from Alex at the St. Albans Museum about crafting projects that have a staff plus volunteer component.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of different ways you can go about this. Maybe the staff is the grants contact, the person developing the proposal, submitting it, responsible for reporting, but the actual legwork for the collections care project is completed by the volunteers who are perhaps contributing their cost share match in terms of their volunteer hours. Another way that you can do it is you can either yourself as a staff person or perhaps hire an external person to come in and do a training session. And so it's a combination of using professional expertise with volunteer time that can be really successful. So if the staff person is supervising the work or perhaps preparing the work plan and the volunteers are implementing that, that's a great way to do it. You may also have one particular volunteer who can become your expert, who can, working with the staff person, develop the work plan and train other volunteers among your cadre of people that you are from your community that you work with to help you do the implementation.
Can I jump in and add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've done several grant-funded projects that did incorporate a volunteer training aspect. I did a NEH-funded preservation assistance grant at Landmark College in their library and archives, and I went down and looked at a collection and helped them decide exactly what rehousing materials they needed, how to improve general storage and handling conditions. But I also, as part of that grant, went down and taught the library archives manager and her group of volunteers how to actually do the rehousing project themselves. So a lot of these grants have room for tying in staff and volunteers and the consultant. And I think when I've served as a grant reviewer, you want to see those kinds of applications because you want this knowledge and expertise to be spread out as much as possible. So I think when you can include working with volunteers and training volunteers or staff that don't have prior experience, that can make a really strong grant application. Another example, I've been working with the historic theater curtains projects for conservation treatment and Curtains Without Borders, and that's a big part of those projects that are grant funded. As Michelle knows, part of that is training the volunteers at those local historical societies or town halls how to help do the actual preservation of those historic theater curtains. So I think that's a great question, and I think that's a good thing to really keep in the back of your minds as you're applying for grants and sort of structuring how the project might work.
One other thing to add, to just piggyback on that, Carolyn, is that if you are coming from an organization that is primarily consists of volunteer labor, or perhaps even an all volunteer historical society, for example, I think reviewers will be really receptive to projects that spread out the expertise and also don't rely on one person to do the work, because there's always the consciousness that that volunteers often are wearing many hats for many different commitments, and so perhaps some of them are in our neck of the woods are seasonal, so they might be involved in an organization during the temperate months and then are going as a snowbird to a different part of the country for other parts of the year. So if you can spread out the expertise both during the project and then also demonstrate that you've thought about the long-term sustainability of that expertise in terms of passing the baton to a new board, for example, in a few years, that's a great way to make a very compelling argument for your proposal.
I'll add one more thing too, just to sort of piggyback on that. Another tactic that has worked really well in some of the grants that I've worked on is if you are having a consultant come in and teach a workshop or talk about a specific issue that might also be relevant to other organizations in your area. If you're willing to extend an invitation to them to attend that workshop or training session, and you can include that in your grant application, and reviewers will give you extra stars for that, because again, you're spreading that knowledge as far as possible, and that can give you a really big leg up. And it gives you a good chance to meet your colleagues if you don't know them, and figure out other ways that you guys can work together. So I think that's another great thing to think about.
So we had a question from Eliza, a very good one, about, can you say a little more about your vision for a cohort? And I'll just say that it's dependent on what people want and what you are wanting to do. There's a few scenarios. One would be that in sifting through the folks who reach out, that we determined that, yeah, the grant that we were just talking about, the National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation Assistance Grant for small institutions, is something that would be appropriate for 3 or 4 different organizations to be applying for, that we would, each organization would work independently on their proposal, but maybe as a cohort, we would try to set some timelines and deadlines and have an informal get-together every couple of weeks just for a progress report. It can often, especially if you're a lone arranger, or if you've got many other pressing responsibilities, or both are true for you, it can be really tough to find the time and the headspace for working on a proposal. So sometimes if you have a deadline, you're like, oh shoot, I'm meeting with Eliza next week. I've got to be able to show her I've done something. That might be able to help motivate some folks to actually move forward on this project. And I can alternately cheerlead and like threaten if that would be effective. You just have to let me know what works best for you. So my sense is that we can try to move each other forward, and I'm trying to do more of this collaborative stuff virtually. Actually going to do some genealogical research as a group next week, which is going to be fun. So this idea of kind of how can we're all working independently yet together, and working that way. It may be more likely that there's different opportunities that different folks are working on, but it may still be useful to come together just to share what are the obstacles for you? What are you caught on? What are you having trouble articulating? Especially with, I found it really difficult to make my proposals sing. The heyday for me of grant application writing was when I was at Historical Society of Pennsylvania, because we had a development officer, and I would do the nuts and bolts of this is what we want to do, hand the narrative off to her, and she would just make it shine and just make it sound like these things were the most amazing materials you've ever come across. Being the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, that was often true, but I had trouble kind of honking the horn. So sometimes it might be that we can find someone here within our group is really good at hyperbolic but not over the top language in terms of describing materials and how fabulous they are. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to help each other out, and to be those outside readers for each other, and offer support and substantive critique. Any other comments or questions?
I just want to make sure everyone saw in the chat that Carolyn has added in the site for another grant, with its deadline being January 14, 2021. So be sure to take note of that. And I'd just like to say that, just like to say that, if you can benefit so much by collaborating with your colleagues in the area, with one another, because not only does that build strengthening for you applying for grants if you go into a cohort situation, or just reach out with questions that you have, but it also helps you, again, know who's in the area, get to meet people, because in New England we are so spread out, and we don't always have the opportunity to come together and network or meet one another. Sometimes it's only at an annual conference, and sometimes the budgets do not allow for that annual conference, so that networking opportunity is lost. So just be sure to, try to reach out with others that you have met here today in the webinar, or certainly through CCCA, we can get you engaged with others, and just feel like you're not alone and that there are others out there facing the same problems that you have and facing the same needs and wants to move themselves forward and get their collections really well in shape and develop those standards and best practices. So I see that Eileen has had to leave, so this makes me, I guess, in charge of things. So one thing I'd like to ask is if there are any other questions that you might have or something we haven't touched upon. Okay, so seeing as how there are no specific questions, let me just close out with a few things. First of all, we'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope you found that today's webinar has been informative and maybe has given you some new ideas, maybe has given you support and enthusiasm to approach this. And remember, as I had mentioned, and as Erica had mentioned, if the first time doesn't work, don't worry, try again, find out what went wrong, and just keep plugging along, because eventually you will get some monies. Let the CCCA know what kind of workshops, presentations, lectures you'd like to have us make available to you by sending us an email, and I did include that in the chat box in a couple of places. Plus, I will follow up with each of you with a follow-up email from the CCCA, just thanking you for joining us today and reminding you of a few things that I'll be mentioning here, so you don't have to worry about taking your notes. Check out, again, on our website, our membership criteria and consider applying. It's easy and it's reasonable, and at least for the end of this year, we are offering free membership for students and emerging professionals. So that's a good way to start networking, find out who's in the field and what's going on. Hopefully you'll be able to join us at 9 a.m. on Saturday, October 31st for a Halloween coffee break during the Vermont Lakes Conference. So put that on your calendars if you're attending the conference. One last note I'd like to mention is that should any in the audience be archivists or anyone interested in culture, preservation, archives, and history, be sure to check out Archives in Context. You can find that information on the CCCA website. Again, that website was included in the chat under the Events tab, and the email address to register is also in the details. It's a month-long series of weekly conversations with noted professionals in the field here in New England. Rachel was one of the moderators for last week's panel. Carolyn and I will be on this evening's panel. And again, it's week-long, so it's in the evenings at 6:30. And the series is free, it's open to the public, and celebrates National Archives Month, which is this month of October. So if there is nothing else that my colleagues from the board would like to mention, I will just say thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Okay, everybody, I guess that's it. So anybody have anything else to say? Okay, so with that, thank you again, take care, and we'll see you in the future.
Yep, we'll be in touch. Thank you. Hi, Meta. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Peter. I want to get to know you.
All right. See ya.
Guys. Bye.
Bye.